Hey YouTube, so first of all I wanted to point out that the auctions that I told you about in the last video are ending today. So we've got the auction of the final books. I've sold pretty much all my books, but there's the last 8 books from my collection. I've put them up all together as one auction, and if you win that auction you will also receive a link to a special secret video, a video just for you, which will solve one of the mysteries associated with my channel. I'll just give you that little teaser there. So there's a little clue for you. It's going to solve a mystery. So yeah, that's that auction ending today. I've got a few other auctions as well. There's a big set of about 30 experimental CDs, various different experimental bands. There's also a set of I think it's 6 Glenn Branca CDs. Then there's another set of Acid Mother's Temple CDs. There's the set of Werner Herzog films. Again, the links for this, you can get it in the description. There's a link to a Google document which has the links to eBay for those auctions if you're interested. Again, those auctions are ending today, so if you are interested, now's the time. Okay, so anyway. With that said, what I wanted to talk about today was this interesting article I read by Eric Schwitzgebel called Inflate and Explode. And he talks about a kind of fallacy that's quite common in analytic philosophy, which he calls the inflate and explode. It's a kind of argumentative strategy where, so essentially the thought is this, right? Lots of philosophers will give arguments against the existence of various things. And if you want to give an argument against the existence of something, against the existence of X, then what you do essentially is you say, look, anything that is X must have a certain property. So anything that is X must have property A. And then you deny that there is any such property. The assumption here, of course, is that X's necessarily have property A. And what Schwitzgebel says is, if that assumption is wrong, then we have a kind of inflate and explode argument. So the idea is that what's being done here is we're assuming a kind of inflated conception of the thing. We're sort of assuming a view of the thing, or we're presupposing a theory of the thing that just sort of modifies the concept. You propose a much more kind of theoretically robust, theoretically committed version of the concept, and then you show that there's nothing like that. But of course, that doesn't really tell you much about the ordinary concept. So, for example, Schwitzgebel talks in the article about consciousness. He thinks that this is something that can be found in a lot of the philosophers who give these kind of skeptical views of consciousness. Eliminativists about consciousness will assume that consciousness necessarily has some property. So maybe this is phenomenal properties, or maybe this is qualia, or maybe this is epistemic infallibility or indubitability, or maybe this is irreducibility, or maybe it's immateriality or something like that, right? And then you assume, okay, consciousness is such that it is irreducible. Consciousness is such that it is, like states of consciousness are indubitable. And then you argue, well, nothing has that property, right? Nothing is such that it is irreducible in the relevant sense. Nothing is such that it is indubitable in the relevant sense. So, of course, given that consciousness must have that property, and given that nothing has that property, consciousness doesn't exist. And I mean, the obvious problem with this move is it seems open to us to just say, well, since when does consciousness have to have that property? That's not part of our ordinary conception of consciousness. So you've inflated the concept and then exploded it, right? You've inflated consciousness and exploded it. And this is a fallacy. Now, I think that, one thing to bear in mind here is that there's also the reverse fallacy. So just as it's possible to inflate and explode, it looks like you could also have the fallacy of deflate and retain. So any attempted elimination, any argument against the existence of something can always be resisted by just deflating the concept, deflating it kind of almost beyond recognition. So let's so to remain within, philosophy of mind, right? Like take the idea of belief, for instance. Now, you might read people like Paul Churchland, eliminativists about belief, and you might accept pretty much everything that they're saying about the nature of the mind and the brain and all of that, and the nature of the world, like what the world contains. But then you just say, well, the theory of belief that these eliminativists are working with is an inflated. It's like an inflated theory. It's no part of our ordinary notion of belief. And indeed, you can kind of keep pushing that. So whatever argument somebody comes up with against the existence of belief, you could just kind of keep deflating the notion. And eventually you could say, look, there's no commitment here to sort of representationalism or to functionalism or to behaviorism. So, a belief doesn't have to involve representing. So like the belief that P does not necessarily involve the representation that the proposition P is true. Similarly, the belief that P does not have to involve any particular kind of behavioral disposition or anything like that. Anytime somebody attacks what might be associated with belief, you can always just say, well, belief has nothing. That's not really what belief is. And now the danger, of course, of the deflate and retain strategy is you might find yourself in a position where it becomes unclear what it is you're actually even retaining. So clearly there are certain concepts, there are certain ways of using words that don't seem to involve any commitments whatsoever to, anything about the way the world is. I might, just because I exist within a particular linguistic community, if I see something surprising happen, I might say like, oh, Jesus Christ, like somebody falls down in front of me, I'm like, oh, Jesus, right? And or I might maybe use language that has a more obvious propositional form. I might let's say I'm in a car, there's a near miss, a car nearly hits me, right? There's nearly a crash, I get away with it, and then I just say something like, oh, God must have been smiling at me. Like God must have, there was an angel looking out for me, right? So these are sort of propositions, right? God was smiling at me, or there was an angel looking out for me. But of course, like I'm not committed to the existence of God or angels or anything like that. This is just a linguistic convention. There's no, when I say these things, there's no commitment to any kind of philosophical theory. It's just some way of using words, right? In fact, note, there's not even a commitment to like a fictionalist account of this sort of religious language. So it's not just that I don't have any commitment to like the nature of God or angels. I also don't have any particular commitment about what that language is doing. I'm not necessarily a fictionalist about God talk. Indeed, I might actually explicitly believe that a fictionalist account of religious language doesn't make sense philosophically, but then I just carry on using the words anyway. Again, because it's just a sort of linguistic convention. So the point is you can kind of endlessly deflate concepts, right? You can sort of endlessly deflate these things and protect them from elimination. But then the worry is you might well end up in a position where there's not really a distinction between, like you're saying, okay, beliefs exist, but then it might well be that if we ask, well, like, what is a belief? It might well be that you just don't have any kind of answer to that. And then how would you distinguish between the idea that beliefs exist from the idea that, look, belief talk is like when we this language of belief, like when I say Frank believed blah blah blah, how would we then distinguish that kind of discourse from the sort of discourse where I, as an atheist, will say things like God must have been smiling at me, right? So if your philosophical account of belief is just, I have like absolutely nothing to say about it, I'm not making any commitments whatsoever. Well, then how is it any different from that? Yes. Anyway, I think that this is. So the point is, we have these sort of two different sort of strategies, right? When we're arguing for the non-existence of something, then you can kind of end up doing this inflate and explode. If you're arguing for the existence of something, you can deflate and retain. Now, again, Schwitzgebel presented inflate and explode as a fallacy. But I think there's an interesting question about, where we sort of draw the line between the fallacy and the legitimate application of this type of argumentative structure. So, to put my cards on the table, here's what I'm going to say. It seems to me that what we're doing with this type of argumentative structure, if we take inflate and explode, what inflate and explode does is it says, okay, anything that's X must have property A, but nothing is there is no property A. Property A is not instantiated, so nothing is X, right? What I think is there's just no fact of the matter whether X's necessarily have property A, right? So that's the case for any X for any property. So there's no fact of the matter whether any argument commits the inflate and explode fallacy or whether any argument commits the deflate and retain fallacy. So any argument for or against the existence of something is going to have this kind of structure, right? We're going to either be, if we're arguing against the existence of something, we're going to say, well, all X's must have property A, but there is nothing with property A, so there are no X's. If we're deflating and retain, if we're arguing for the existence of something, then we're going to say, like, no, X's don't require property A. So X's can still exist even in the absence of property A, right? But what I would suggest is, it seems to me that just in general, there is no fact of the matter whether X's must have property A. So there's going to be no fact of the matter whether arguments with this structure commit either of these fallacies. So Schwitzgebel himself in the article, he gives the example of ghosts, right? And he cites this as an example of an argument with the same sort of structure as inflate and explode, but where it's not fallacious. So his argument is this: ghosts must be immaterial, nothing is immaterial, so there are no ghosts. Now, Schwitzgebel says this is a good argument. He says this isn't an example of the inflate and explode fallacy. But why? Like, what? My reaction to this was like, what? Why are you assuming that ghosts have to be immaterial? What is that? Where does that assumption come from? Look. In fact, if we think of what it is for something to be material as that thing is extended in space and time, or it has causal powers, then I think that the common sense conception of ghosts would actually be that they are material beings. The common sense conception of ghosts is that they are things that, they seem to be things that occupy a spatio-temporal location, and that they have causes and effects, right? So again, it's just like the ordinary view of ghosts. If you think about, like, when people say they believe in ghosts, they seem, if you ask them to elaborate on what it is they believe in, right, they seem to be talking about things that exist in particular spatio-temporal locations and that cause various things to happen, and that seems like that's at least one way of understanding what a material object is. So I would just say, like, okay, well, what's the basis for this claim, right? That ghosts must be immaterial. I don't know where that came from. Actually, this point about materiality brings up, I suppose, another issue with inflate and explode or deflate and retain type arguments, which is, whenever you give any kind of argument like this, you're going to have to assume something about what property A is. So not only are you going to have to assume something about what X is, you have to assume something about what property A is. So we're saying, if we're doing the inflate and explode, it's like all X's have property A, there is no property A, so there are no X's, right? But okay, wait a minute, what exactly is property A? So when Schwitzgebel says, look, nothing is immaterial, right? Ghosts must be immaterial, nothing is immaterial. Well, what are we assuming immateriality is? Or what are we assuming it is for something to be a material property? So I think that not only can X's be the target of the inflate and explode or deflate and retain, of course, the property A can also be the target of that. And I mean, of course it can, because when you think about it, it's like, well, yeah, these argumentative structures can be used against anything in principle. Like you could plug anything you like into them. So yeah, I mean, obviously you can do that. But anyway, so yes, to return to the point about ghosts, I think this is a great example because I mean, clearly it seems, you know, Schwitzgebel's linguistic intuitions, I suppose, or his theoretical intuitions, or whatever you want to call them, are such that, you know, he thinks that ghosts must be immaterial. And I just don't share that kind of view. I don't think that people, when people talk about ghosts, they don't seem to be committed to any particular philosophical theory of what ghosts are. Of course, actually, that maybe can't be quite right, can it? Because seem to be committed to something. I mean, certainly people can, you know, it's not like when people use ghost discourse, they're using it in the way that I was using the religious discourse. A lot of the people who say that they believe in ghosts do seem to have significant differences in their worldview, you know, relative to the people who don't believe in ghosts, right? And so it's not just a linguistic game, at least apparently. But the question is, you know, how do we establish what the what the essential features of a concept are? I mean, that's ultimately what we're asking here, is when we say that an argument commits either of these fallacies, we're assuming something about the essential features of the thing that is targeted by that argument. And it's very unclear how we go about establishing what the essential features of these things is supposed to be. So what is the essential property of a ghost? Like, what would count as either establishing that, you know, there really are ghosts or there really aren't ghosts? So one thing that we might try to appeal to here is a kind of linguistic evidence, right? So suppose, for instance, that I was to argue that there are no ghosts because nothing is immaterial. And let's say I'm able to convince everybody that there indeed are no immaterial things. So everybody just agrees with that. Everybody becomes materialists. But I find, to my horror, that loads of people still believe in ghosts. So everybody just comes to agree with materialism, but they still go on talking about ghosts, right? So you might think, well, this indicates that my original argument was an inflate and explode argument. What I must have been doing in that original argument is assuming an inflated conception of ghosts. It must be that I was assuming that immateriality was one of the essential properties of ghosts, but actually I was just wrong. You know, people, when we talk about ghosts, when people say they believe in ghosts, they're not actually committed explicitly or implicitly to immaterial things. That's just not part of the ghost concept. It's not an essential feature of the ghost concept, even if it's associated with the ghost concept. But I don't think this kind of evidence is really that useful here, because, I mean, there's one possibility for what could explain this sequence of events, right? Me giving this argument, everyone agreeing that there are no immaterial things, and then everybody's still talking about ghosts. One possibility that could explain that is that the original concept, before I gave my argument, the original ghost concept, did indeed presuppose immateriality. So prior to me giving the argument, when everybody talked about ghosts, it did, like, that concept did just have, like, as an essential feature of the concept, immateriality, okay? But then when faced with my argument, what happened is people really did just drop that concept. They stopped believing in ghosts. But then they just adopted a very closely related concept that did not have immateriality as an essential feature of it. So they did eliminate the original concept, but they just replaced it with a very closely related concept, and then they just used the same word to express this new concept. And I mean, we can find cases of this plausibly happening historically. I mean, there's a plausible argument, I think, that something like this happened with the term atom. So, you know, if we think about like, okay, what was the motivation for introducing the term atom? It looks like the whole point of introducing that term is that it was supposed to be the basic building block, right? Like the atom is the thing at the very bottom, right? The atom is the thing that cannot be broken down any further. But then, of course, it turned out that the things we were calling atoms you could break them down further. You could break them down into protons and neutrons. Plausibly, this is a case where the concept changed, but the word stayed the same. So atoms, as people thought of atoms in like 1850, atoms as they were thought of in 1850 really did end up getting eliminated. But, you know, so what? Right? I mean, we eliminated it, but we just carried on using the same word. So yeah, I mean, it looks like in the case of ghosts, the same thing could happen. In the case of consciousness, the same thing could happen, right? Maybe everybody comes to agree that there is nothing that has the property of epistemic indubitability, but they carry on talking about consciousness. That wouldn't in itself indicate that consciousness, as we understand it prior to that argument being given, that consciousness is not essentially indubitable, right? Maybe the concept just was eliminated and replaced, and we just used something with the same word. We used the same word for a different concept. Now, of course, what I actually think, from my point of view, is the very idea that concepts have essential properties seems like the wrong way to think about it. But if you think of concepts more as just this kind of like, look, when we talk about a concept, this is in a way kind of like an idealization. I mean, look, there's all sorts of ways that people use language. There's all sorts of beliefs that people have. There's, you know, ways people kind of think about the world. People will, you know, have like sentences in their heads, right? They write books and they have ideas in their minds, and sometimes people have pictures in their heads. There's all of these things going on. And when we talk about concepts, this is just a kind of, you know, useful idealization of this, you know, mess of sort of, you know, thoughts and speech and you know, shared investigations, right? Well, from that point of view, okay, maybe talking about concepts as having essential properties is just the wrong way to think about concepts. But then it's not really clear that there's going to be any fact of the matter. Well, I don't think there will be any fact of the matter whether somebody is giving, you know, whether somebody who argues against the existence of something is giving an argument that is an inflate and explode fallacy, or is just a perfectly legitimate application of, you know, the type of argument where you deny the existence of something. Yes, I mean, interesting article by Eric Schwitzgebel. Some thoughts on that there. I've been talking for about 20 minutes. I'm not sure if I've really said anything in those 20 minutes. That was all a bit of a jumble, wasn't it? I have another video, an earlier video called "There is no such thing as truth," where I think that this point about, well, there doesn't seem to be any clear way of determining whether or not, so when we say something exists, there's no real clear way of determining whether the argument for or against the existence of that, like, what are we assuming about the concept of that? Anyway, the point is, that earlier video, I think, expressed some similar ideas, maybe in slightly better terms. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether what I said there really made any sense at all. Actually, I'm not really happy with this video. That's like 24 minutes. It doesn't seem like I actually expressed anything in 24 minutes, which isn't really a very nice place to leave it. But it's done now. To be honest, the only reason why I actually made this video was because I wanted to draw your attention to the auctions, because they're ending now. Like, they're ending. So I needed an excuse to do that. That's all this was. This was just made for that purpose. So that's why it's kind of rubbish. Anyway, see you next time.